Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Barlet. I'm the founder and the executive director of the Able Gamers charity. So I want to start with this one slide that talks about, from time to time, I'm known to not really be politically correct. Disability is something real for me. I work with people who are disabled every day. I have several disabilities of my own. And sometimes being disabled is really funny. And so I don't use necessarily the right words. Don't get mad at me. It's just, it is what it is. So this is me. This is one of the happiest moments of my life. If you'll notice, I've lost 113 pounds since that photo was taken. But this is me helping a young man play Forza, a racing game, and he was having the time of his life. I usually tell people how we founded Able Gamers, but they only gave me 20 minutes, and I have a 40-minute presentation here, so I'm going to skip that. Other than to say we do really good things, helping people with disabilities have rich social experiences using video games as our tool. If I seem a little distracted, I'll tell you these lights make you look like you're about to be run over by 2 Jeeps. So I want to talk about why you should really be focusing on making games for people with disabilities. And in order to do that, you have to kind of really understand what your audience looks like. I'm using these blocks here to represent the gaming public. They're Minecraft blocks, for anyone that's played Minecraft. See, I know where my bread's buttered, Bryce. And I want to break them down into demographics. This represents gamers under the age of 18. If you'll look at it, it's about 18%. One thing most people don't realize is this is gamers over 50, 29%. Who here thought that kids played the most games? It's not true. If you overlay, though, the prevalence of disability on top of these blocks, represented by these little blue circles, you're going to notice something. And what you're going to notice is the older you get, the more likely it is that you're going to be disabled. We actually used this knowledge when we were becoming Able Gamers and as we were growing, because when we went to a developer and I said, hey, developer, have you ever thought about how someone with disabilities would play your game? They would panic because that sounds hard. It sounds real hard. So we kind of said, that's a terrible idea. Let's not approach it that way. Let's approach it differently. And so we wrote a white paper, Aging in Gaming. And we said, have you ever thought about how your grandma would play video games? Now, everyone laughed because thinking of their grandma playing, Call of Duty is funny. But what it really did, though, was it got them, it put an image in their mind that wasn't scary. It's grandma. Now, my grandma, I had a really nice grandma and I had a scary grandma. Sometimes grandmas were a bad thing for me. But when we started talking that way, people really started engaging. Well, my grandmother would need bigger text. My grandmother would really have a hard time with this. And I'm like, yeah, keep going. And what they were doing is they were actually building accessibility features. The statistics, though, and what I want to talk to you guys about is the why, not the how. We'll give you some resources for that. But in the United States, 1 in 5 people are disabled. But more importantly, there's this concept called the sphere of influence. So who here has someone who is either disabled or someone in their immediate family that is disabled? Yeah. The reality is 32.8% of people have someone in their immediate family that's disabled. Immediate family. And let's talk about the money there, because this is important. If you look at people with disabilities, we had a philosophy, and our philosophy at Able Gamers was, I can tell any developer a sad story and get you to do one thing for me one time. Hey, there's this kid here who can't hit the baseball in MLB 14. Can you make this one mode? Sure, I'll make Little Johnny mode. That helped Little Johnny, but it didn't help. But if I come to you and talk about the market in the fact that people with disabilities have money that they want to give you, and all of you are working in an industry where you're fighting for eyeballs, then you can start using accessibility as a market differentiator. In the United States, the disposable income of people with disabilities is $247 billion. Now, I just gave this talk 2 months ago in Europe, so I had to put euros under everything. So if that's what you want to work in, it's there. When you start looking at that sphere of influence, it's $2.4 trillion in expendable income. Now, I've traveled the world to know that the United States isn't the only place in the world. When you start looking at Europe, these are our numbers: 500 billion in expendable income, 4.4 trillion in their sphere of influence. When you start adding the rest of the world, you're now close to 750 billion. I'm not even including South America because the numbers there were impossible to find, but I know we're up to $1 billion in expendable income from people with disabilities, and so much money in the sphere of influence it isn't even funny. I talk to developers all the time who put accessibility features in their games, but they don't say anything. And why don't they say anything? Well, there's this stigma that says that accessibility features mean my game isn't challenging. And that's bullcrap. We know that, you know, the features are there for people that need them. It doesn't really cut into the hardcore gameplay. And I try to talk to developers about, you need to be clear about your accessibility, because this is the money. I'm going to go and support goods and services. Who here makes decisions on what they buy based on the morals of the company that they support? I do. So if you tell me that you have spent some effort in making your game accessible, as a person with disabilities, I'm going to give you a second look. I might have already passed your game up because I don't play Kitten Stabber 3000 because I love kittens. But now that you've told me that there's a one-button mode and that you've got colorblind mode so that I can tell the good kittens from the bad kittens, I'm going to take a second look and you might get a sale. So we work for gaming for everyone. I'm going to give you a little bit of an example of the prevalence of disabilities, but I want to kind of just tell you some real quotes that I live my life by, and it's, "To improve is to change, and to be perfect is to change often." This was Winston Churchill. Interestingly enough, I think the game development companies are doing a much better job than they had in the past with being able to change. Before it was, we had a process, this is how we do it, we continue to do it. And I think that the indie developers have really, in the last 5 years, changed the market in such an amazing way, where there was a time that I think our AAA partners were kind of taken aback. And now the AAA partners have come back and they're starting to really implement some of the agile methodologies that got the indie developers where they are. And now this ability to change is something that can be done much more rapidly than it's ever been done before. Able Gamers did write includification. I was working at a conference where they were talking about gamifying everything. They were gamifying all sorts of things. And I came up with this word includification, to includify people, which is like part of gamify. I am somewhat privileged that Forbes wrote a story when we published this, and they said, "Eye-bleeding title aside, this is a must-read." So I was kind of excited that Forbes recognized this. Always focus on the gamer and good design practices, and the disabilities largely take care of themselves. Bryce and I were actually at dinner last night, and we were talking about EA. EA makes some really accessible games. They don't mean them to be accessible, but their design process and their budgets allow them to create games that become really accessible because they just have a process that says, we need to have button remappability as a norm. Colorblind is a norm. I'll tell you a really interesting story. The game is no longer around, but it was Warhammer Online. And it was probably one of the most accessible games I'd ever played. that was completely invisible. And one of the interesting thing was the creative director of it was colorblind, but he never told anybody. And he was the creative director. And people were presenting art to him, and he would reject the art. I don't like it. It's not really that clear to me. And after about 3 months on the project, they were in a room, and they were showing off a bunch of art, and he was doing his thing, and one of the developers just had the guts to say, I have a question, Paul. Are you colorblind? And he goes, oh, I actually am, yeah. And then it got the whole room like quiet, because he's like, you guys never really bothered to get to know why I was rejecting it. So they created a complete scheme where the colors were blue and orange, because this was before they were able to do colorblind overlays, because blue and orange was the most uncommon colorblindness there was. But they also had second channel visuals for everything. They had sounds for everything. So no matter what you perceived, you always knew something was happening. Give you a quick example of how disabilities are prevalent. These are all mobility disabilities. All of these people are gamers. To talk about that sphere of influence, I want to whittle this down to just this list. So I founded Able Gamers because my best friend had multiple sclerosis. We were going to play EverQuest, and one night her mousing hand wouldn't work. So instead of playing EverQuest, I spent the evening Yahooing for stuff, because we weren't Googling at the time, and looking for resources for her. We weren't really finding anything. And so we took that as a calling. My husband has Charcot-Marie tooth syndrome. I'm actually paralyzed. I've got paresis of the left leg. I have no feeling in my left leg from an accident I had while I was serving in the military. This chief operating officer of Able Gamers has spinal muscular atrophy, and my mother died 2 years ago at 62 of a stroke. It was her third stroke. This is what I talk about with sphere of influence. These are the disabilities that affect our lives. This is why looking at accessibility not as a nice to have but a necessity is important. Who here are gamers? Wow, everyone raised their hand. Oh, you at the last minute you raised it. Who's going to be a gamer next year? Who's going to be a gamer in 30 years? The chances are, though, you're going to be disabled. By the time you're 50, you have a 22% chance of having a disability. By the time you're 80, you have a 93% chance of being disabled. Really quickly, I want to finish up, because I'm almost out of time, with the regulatory environment. So there's this thing called the CVAA in the United States. It is really around communication, but it is super vague on what it requires. I would highly recommend you read it. But what it requires is that if your game can be used to communicate, it has to be accessible. But it's so vague, it could be also used for other things. The important thing to remember is you have to do due diligence. You have to show that you did your best to comply with it in order for lawsuits, and they're real. The first one actually just sprang against Netflix 2 weeks ago under the CVAA. Video games are under another one-year extension, which expires on January 1st, 2019. It will not have another one. The video game industry has been under extension for 4 years now. Bryce and I were talking about how Xbox, PlayStation had to comply with CVAA. I don't know about you, but if I was a blind person, an Xbox would be the last thing I would use as a communication device. But because it is technically a communication device, it fell under CVAA. In Europe, it's a little bit different. The UN is trying to look at access to video games as part of their Commission on Human Rights. The EU is always also talking about a CVAA type equivalent. I want to end with a quote that I love by Ralph Bouchet, who was a Nobel Prize winning African American in the 1950s. And he said, "Man learns and knows, but he does not do well as he knows. This is our weakness. The future peace and harmony of this world is contingent upon the ability of the world, yours and mine, to effect a remedy. We owe it to everyone here. You know, I will end by saying, you know, it's been brought up in this room before about the recent election that we had. And I have found that because of the news, I am finding that I am more kind than I've ever been before. That I'm going out of my way to acknowledge and recognize the fellow human beings around me, because I want to be part of a solution, not part of a problem. And that's what this quote is all about, is affecting change. So this is my contact. This is the greatest slide in the world, by the way, but this is my contact information. I thank you guys very much for giving me the time.